From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I am so glad to be here today, that all of us are here today, to celebrate a wonderful voice in children's literature, Cynthia Kadohata. Critics have praised the emotional richness, depth, and gentle humor of Cynthia's novels. Her writing has a quiet power. You as readers know that kind of power. It sneaks up on you when you're reading, and suddenly you're weeping and smiling and cheering for the main character all at the same time. This is a wonderful experience for readers, and I'm sure you've had it too. However, it can be a little embarrassing when it happens and you're in a public place and people start patting you on the back and handing you tissues because you've reached that moment of quiet power in one of Cynthia's books. So be prepared for that moment with Cynthia's new novel, Half a World Away. Cynthia's novels have won many prestigious awards: the Newbery Medal for Kira Kira, the National Book Award for The Thing About Luck, and the Jane Addams Peace Award for Weedflower. But probably what her readers appreciate the most is that quiet power and the whole weeping, smiling experience. Cynthia's novels touch and sustain us. They connect us to universal experiences and to our own very human hearts. Please join me in welcoming Cynthia Kadohata.
Hello. Okay, I'm just going to start. I'm going to talk about where I get my ideas, because that's the question I get asked most by kids. In a way, I feel as if my ideas find me, not the other way around. Then, when the idea finds me, my editor likes me to immerse myself in a different reality, the reality of the idea. She wants the idea to seem like my home, where I live. So research and personal experience become as important as the original idea. For instance, in my book, A Million Shades of Grey, a young boy who's indigenous to South Vietnam works intimately with an elephant. My editor told me, we're supposed to be having about, we're supposed to be having my elephant, there it is. My editor told me that in my research for the book, she wanted me to touch an actual elephant. That really stumped me. I mean, how was I going to touch an elephant? So I called the San Diego Zoo and asked if I could spend some time with their head elephant caretaker. We ended up spending a few hours together at the zoo. He was extremely animated, and as he talked, he liked to wave one of his arms in the air in front of himself like it was an elephant trunk. But no matter how much I cajoled, he said I absolutely could not touch one of the elephants. It was hard, because I knew that all I had to do was take a few steps forward and I could touch one of them that was right in front of me. But I didn't. Then somehow or other, I found a company that trains elephants for the entertainment industry, commercials, movies, etc. So I got to touch one of their elephants. And I did feel that touching it taught me something that I couldn't have learned simply from reading. It sounds crazy, but I felt that when I laid my hand upon that animal, I understood something of the sensitivity of elephants. It actually made me cry afterwards. I think that to be a writer, your whole life and each book has to be like a series of touching elephants. Sometimes the ideas are right in front of me. My first children's book, Kira Kira, was full of real-life details, though these did not seem like details from my life as I wrote, because they were mixed up in my subconscious with my imagination and research. In real life, my family moved a couple of times to Georgia in the late 1950s, so I decided to set my first book, Kira Kira, in Georgia. I learned to talk in that state in real life, and growing up, I had a very heavy Southern accent, just like the narrator of Kira Kira. I also read up on the state before I started writing. In both my real life and in Kira Kira, the father toiled long hours in a hatchery as a chicken sexer, which is when you separate newborn chickens between male and female. In real life, once my sister and I started school, my mother used to make us curl our hair, even though we looked ridiculous. This same detail is used in Kira Kira. I also had a little brother. When he was born, the whole hospital staff marched by just to look at him because they had never seen a Japanese baby before. This was also in Kira Kira. The book is about a young Japanese-American family made up of a mother and father, an older sister, Lynn, the main character, Katie, and a toddler brother, Sammy. Lynn dies from lymphoma toward the end of the book. During the book, her disease ebbs and flows as the story progresses. The book was actually strongly influenced by my relationship with my dog, Sarah, who I got from a shelter in 1992. After 2 days and many hours at the shelter, I chose her to adopt for a number of reasons, including that there was a sign hanging on her cage that said, "Sarah, nice dog." Inside was a big black, half Doberman, half Labrador. When Mark, my then husband, and I brought her home, she began acting crazy. Over and over, she would jump up and nip at my forehead. She was incredibly agile, almost like a cat. Mark knelt to get on her level. She jumped up and down, falling against his nose, which promptly started spurting blood. We couldn't calm her down, so we went inside to regroup. Every time I went out back that afternoon, she would bite at my forehead or my forearms. Later, I had bruises all over my arms. Though we planned on an inside dog, Mark and I felt we couldn't let her into the house while we were sleeping, so I placed some bedding down in the porch area. But Sarah didn't sleep much. Every time I woke up that night, I could hear her toenails going tap, tap, tap up and down the driveway. I also heard other noises, but wasn't sure what they were. The next day when I got up, I peered timidly into the backyard. Plants were strewn everywhere. It looked like a hurricane had hit the yard. I had written on the adoption application at the shelter that I would give Sarah a year and a half to try to fit into our household. Later I learned that most people write down things like a week or 2 weeks. But I was determined to give her a year and a half because I had said I would. Then, when we took Sarah for her first walk, her mouth began foaming. Mark and I discussed whether she might be insane. Every day was the same. Sarah would attack the backyard at night, and I would lie in bed wondering why the shelter had written "nice dog" on her sign. My arms were constantly covered with bruises. I had scratches on my forehead. When I put food in her bowl, she would nudge it out of the bowl with her nose so that it lay spilled all around the bowl. Apparently, she didn't like us, and she didn't like the food we gave her. After we got her, we drove from Los Angeles to Oregon to rent a house on the beach with relatives. We decided to bring Sarah with us. In Oregon, after a trip that was a comedy of errors, I bought her a pillow in a thrift store and I let her sleep with us in the bedroom. As soon as I got the pillow and let her stay with us, Sarah began sleeping more calmly every night, and she stopped acting so crazy. It was as if all she wanted was to have her own pillow. She had a lot of fun at the beach, and every so often when she ran off, she would come back when we called. We wondered how she would act when we got back home. But when we got back home, she no longer nipped at my forehead. And we brought her inside to sleep. Over time, she and I grew so close that I insisted to Mark that we get a futon so that we could lie closer to her level. I can't remember why, but Mark and I even ended up for a while on the sleeping bags on the floor with her. Then, when Sarah was 3.5 years old, we were walking her and she started to limp. We took her to a vet who thought she might have sprained her leg, but he wasn't sure. He sold us a bunch of stuff and charged us a lot of money and sent us home. We took her to another vet who said he could tell by the way she was walking that the problem was some sort of nerve disorder. But what the disorder was, he didn't know. She had lost her agility. We took her to several other vets, but test after test proved fruitless, and nobody could help us. Over and over, Sarah would degenerate to the point where she couldn't walk, could only crawl or lie down. Then she would recover after a few nights of intravenous medication at the vets, and we would bring her home. Mark and I divorced, and Sarah continued her spiral. She'd be fine for days, weeks, even months. Then she would go down again. This happened countless times until finally, 6.5 years after she first got sick, she died. When she died, I cried like I had never cried before. Every day toward the end, she had moved closer to death, while I still believed that she might live. While Sarah was deteriorating in her final year, I'd been writing Kira Kira. The day before Sarah died, I prepared the manuscript for Kira Kira and put it in an envelope to send my editor. Then Sarah died, and my boyfriend told me to write down everything I was feeling, which I did. To get away, we decided to drive from Los Angeles to where my father lived in Grand Junction, Colorado. I forgot all about the manuscript. We drove through a thunderstorm, and lightning seemed to be following us, the closest I'd ever been to lightning, and over. It was a sad but somehow enchanted trip that I'll never forget. When we got back to Los Angeles, I looked over my notes about Sarah's death. I took almost all my notes and inserted them directly into the manuscript in various places. I also rethought the novel, my thoughts now colored by Sarah's death and by that sad but enchanted trip. After a month, I sent the manuscript to my editor, and it turned out that she had me do only one rewrite versus about 5 to 7 for the rest of my books. Another book I wrote was also inspired by Sarah. Dogs weren't even on my radar when I published my first adult novel in 1989. But after I got Sarah, I thought about dogs all the time. I sent my editor a proposal several pages long about a dog from another planet, and she thought it was such a bad idea she didn't even bother to say no. She never commented at all until I asked her about it. Then one day I was surfing the internet and happened upon the fact that dogs had served in Vietnam. This was an idea that seemed to just pop up in front of me. I sent my editor this email about the idea of writing a book about the adventures of one of these dogs. And to my surprise, they gave me a contract based on just the email. First, I studied terrain maps of the way Vietnam was back during the war, then read history books, read online articles, studied many pictures, and finally interviewed dog handlers. When the train and dog handler experiences began to feel like a part of my subconscious, I started to write. The Vietnam vets I interviewed talked passionately of how much they had loved the dogs they served with. The war had ended more than 30 years earlier, yet some of these battle-toughened men cried when they talked to me of their dogs. As I so often do when I interview people, I felt so close to some of these handlers. It was as if I'd known them for years. The dogs enjoyed riding on helicopters. They could be used on boats because sometimes the enemy would hide beneath the water, breathing through straws. The dog could smell their breath. One dog handler cried when he discussed the look his dog had given him as she was being euthanized in Vietnam with an injury. She could have survived the injury, but she wouldn't have been able to work anymore, so she was put down. Her handler said she looked at him like she thought he was betraying her by letting her be killed. He said he still suffers pain and guilt about that look, and that at one time it had caused him a great deal of psychological distress. That dog's name was Cracker. Cracker had saved her handler's life the same day she was euthanized. Writing is liquid, like a river, like life, like time. One sentence flows to another, one idea flows to the next. In 2010, I was in Kansas to accept an award for Cracker. After the ceremony, there was a casual luncheon, during which I chatted very briefly with a woman who mentioned that a family in attendance were custom harvesters. I'd never heard of such a thing. The woman explained that farmers often don't harvest their own crops. They hire custom harvesters who travel through the heartland, harvesting crops for one farm after another. My family had moved a lot when I was young, while my father searched for work. So I'd been on the road quite a bit during early childhood, staying at cheap motels, speeding through grain fields on lonely but gorgeous highways. My first published book was a collection of stories marketed as a novel for grown-ups, with many of the stories taking place on the road. At the time, that was all I wanted to write about. To this day, the road strikes me as dreamlike and mysterious. So the idea of people on the road for several months as they drive from wheat field to wheat field seemed amazing to me. I'd taken a train from California, where I lived, to Kansas. In the middle of the night, as I was waiting in the Kansas station for my train home, I couldn't stop thinking about custom harvesting. From the train station, I sent an email to my editor about it. All the way home, as I stared out the window, I thought of harvesting. I had been working on a novel about a girl whose parents were adopting a baby from Kazakhstan, but my editor felt it wasn't going well because I was using too much of my own experiences since I had adopted my son from Kazakhstan. I think what happens when you gather your ideas too much from your own experiences is you use your conscious rather than your unconscious to write. You think very consciously about your own life details. My very intuitive editor suggested I set aside that adoption novel in favor of writing about harvesting, again based on a short email. A month and a half after visiting Kansas, I flew back there to stay with the family from the luncheon. The wife and mother, Wendy, made sure I had everything I needed to start the novel. Here I am, behind the wheel of the combine, the hulking machine used in harvesting. While in Kansas, I learned some about what the harvesting lifestyle was like. The days could be long. You drove combines beneath the sun, and later, beneath the moon, sometimes putting in 18-hour days, 7 days a week. My father used to work 100-hour weeks, so I strongly related to the work ethic of the harvesters. When I'm doing research, I'm fascinated by the people I need to interview. For writing a harvesting novel, I interviewed harvesters, an expert in mosquitoes, several Irish combine drivers, an American woman who'd almost died from malaria, a child psychologist, and 3 native Japanese. I was starstruck by all of them. They all seemed like celebrities to me. Over the next couple of years, I had a lot of questions as I wrote. and I badgered Wendy relentlessly. I had no idea that while I was badgering her, she was going through a painful divorce. I'm an animal when I'm working, though I don't mean to be. Here's a page from my harvesting manuscript marked up by my editor. And here's a 10-page letter my editor wrote me about changes she thought I should make. One editor once told me the longest editorial letter she ever wrote was 22 pages. After I finished my harvesting novel, I told my editor I was returning to writing about adoption. She was less than enthusiastic, but said okay. Previously, the book had been about an untroubled, unadopted girl whose parents were adopting from a city called Almaty. Almaty, Kazakhstan is where I adopted from in real life. Half a world away is now about a troubled young boy adopted from Romania, whose parents are adopting a baby from a city in Kazakhstan called Kazakhstan. I still used some of my experiences, but this time I relied heavily on interviews with other people who had adopted children, especially from Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, which is about halfway around the world, is part of the former Soviet Union. At the time I was adopting, you were required to spend a minimum of 7 weeks in country. I was in the middle of writing a book about Japanese internment camps while I was in Kazakhstan. I didn't have a computer, so I wrote the book by hand. While I was there, I never knew what was going on. Someone stole the money I paid to hire a translator. I did have a driver, though, named Sam. In the book, there's also a driver named Sam. In real life, I worried a lot because the adoption processes in Kazakhstan can be very unpredictable. You can go to a lot of trouble, sometimes for years, and do a lot of paperwork, and ended up not getting the baby you thought you were adopting. When I told Sam how worried I was about the unpredictability of the process, he said, "You are trying to understand Kazakhstan with logic. You cannot understand it that way." He told me to buy a type of glass eye that they sold all over the country. He said this glass eye would keep bad luck away from me. I stayed in this apartment building for most of the 7.5 weeks I was in Kazakhstan. Sometimes the water that squirted out of the faucet was brown. Every day I would go to the baby house to visit my future son. The baby house director was always yelling at me to put a scarf on, though I'm not sure why. The baby house head doctor was always yelling at me to take the scarf off, again for reasons I didn't understand. People were always yelling at me, actually, but I had no idea why. This same sense of not knowing what's going on is part of the novel. In Kazakhstan, you can grocery shop on the street from a vendor, in a bazaar with dozens of makeshift shops, or in a modern store. While I was in Kazakhstan, one man opened up his car trunk, which was full of meat, and asked me if I wanted to buy any. There was also a pig's head in there if I wanted to buy that. A couple of camels make an appearance in the book. Here are a couple of camels hanging around an apartment building in Kazakhstan, and a different couple of camels dumpster diving. But fortunately, my editor didn't make me touch one. I was so fascinated by the fact that some people hunt with eagles in Kazakhstan that I included a section on eagle hunting in the book. Right now, I'm also writing about hunting with falcons and hawks. Here's the bed my son and I slept on together after I got custody. The most important thing that ever happened to me was that I adopted my beautiful son. Every time my heart hurts, he is the one who can fix it. So adoption is a deep part of who I am. But I knew I had to expand my horizons. I interviewed 9 people who'd adopted from Kazakhstan, and as I often do, badgered some of them relentlessly, until they told me what I felt to be the essence of some of their deepest, most meaningful experiences. While I'd been working on a harvesting book, I met a couple, Diane and John, who'd adopted an extremely troubled 8-year-old Romanian boy. I hadn't thought to write about it at all when I met them. But then when I returned to writing Half a World Away, Their experiences suddenly felt like one of those ideas that jumped right out at me. Diane repeatedly wrote me extensive, brutally honest notes about her experiences raising a troubled child who didn't love them. Some of what she told me can't be put in a children's novel. But Diane and John's story has a happy ending. The boy who hated them as a child moved out at 18 and came to love them. When my son first started to read, I was struck by what a miracle reading is. Letters form words, form paragraphs, form stories. From 26 letters to Where the Wild Things Are, to A Wrinkle in Time, to The Call of the Wild. I've dedicated much of my life to those 26 letters. Working with those 26 letters is an obsessive endeavor. You spend months and years transfixed by your ideas and your research. Writing each novel is almost like you're making yourself. It's like being a shapeshifter. For me, finding each new idea is a lot like my early years with my family. You're searching for a new home, and when life is good, you find it. So I guess we're doing Q&A if anyone has any questions. Okay, no questions? Oh, okay, at least one question.
Hi, I love the book, The Thing About Luck, and I think I read it in one sitting. But the part where she's in the combine and she gets really afraid, and then she gets her courage. We have some line in there, I can't remember it right now, but it's just like she gathers her courage, and to me that was like a big turning point. Is there a part of your life that you looked to where you felt like you had to gather your courage that you were tapping into there, or how did that come about?
There's been nothing like that in particular. I think the only thing I've done that felt courageous was going to Kazakhstan to adopt my son. I was really scared about it. It was, at the time, one of the hardest things I've ever done. Being a mom is like a million times harder, but at the time, adopting was probably the thing that I felt like that I needed the most courage for.
Well, thank you for that book. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Hi, was there a specific author or book that really inspired you to start writing?
I think The Call of the Wild is the book that I love the most, but I also read a lot of short stories when I first started writing. That was back in the 80s, and I read, maybe thousands. I read a lot of short stories. It went on for years and years, and it took about 4 years from when I first started reading short stories to when I published a story in the New Yorker. Before that, I would send out like one story every month. Some of them, they were so embarrassing. But, I think it was reading short stories that really did for me.
Hi, I love your book, Kira Kira. I read it when I was younger, and it really made a big impression on me. And my question was, do you have any advice for people who want to start writing themselves?
Advice for people who want to start writing themselves. I was told at the beginning, make a mess and then clean it up. And by that, they meant just get everything down on paper, and then you can go back and rewrite it. But the most important thing for me is always getting that first draft down on paper. So I would say make a mess and then clean it up was the best advice that I ever got. Good luck. Hi.
What's one short story that you read that's inspired you the most?
The short story I've read that inspired me the most, I forget the name of it. It was William Faulkner's short story, though. He was probably the author that inspired me the most at the beginning of my career.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's really interesting what you said about don't let too much of your conscience and your editor look at. Can you explain a little more about how do you tell between the subconscious and conscious?
I'm not sure how you tell. You do a lot of research, and at some point, it's like I haven't been pregnant, but it's like, I guess if you were pregnant and you just start gathering all this information, and then suddenly you feel like it's time to start writing. So it's more, but the information has to become subconscious before you can really start writing. Like I can't start writing until everything is just second nature to me. So it takes a few months for that to happen. Thanks. Okay, thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.